Uh, no, I'll just keep the recording going. Okay, here we go. So, hi everyone. Welcome to Wild in Hollywood, or How the Golden Age Got Naughty with Intellect. I appreciate them allowing me to have my first hosting experience and conversation with Dr. Kate Hext. I'm Dr. Andrew Rimby. I'm the host and director of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, an arts and culture organization that has a lot of literary podcast conversations. I also have a background in Walt Whitman and Oscar Wilde studies, so very appropriate forum. I want to introduce our guest here today. So, Dr. Kate Hext is Associate Professor in Decadent Literature and the Arts at the University of Exeter and Visiting Professor of English at UHA, no, Iwa, Iwa Women's University in Korea. In addition to the book under discussion today, she has new editions of Wilde's plays forthcoming with Oxford World's Classics in 2024. Very recently, it's going to come out. And she occasionally writes reviews for the TLS. So today we're here to talk about her book, which is going to be available on May 28th, Wild in the Dream Factory, Decadence and the American Movies. So welcome to this intellect conversation, Kate.
Hi, Andrew. It's really nice to be here.
So my first question is just if you could provide an overview of your new book and just getting us all into this Oscar Wilde Hollywood American cinema world, if you would, please us with, what the whole premise is of your book.
Yeah, sure. So, my book is about how Oscar Wilde influenced early Hollywood cinema. And if you know anything about Oscar Wilde, or you know anything about Hollywood cinema, it might seem like quite a strange juxtaposition, right? We think about Oscar Wilde as being a Victorian writer, a kind of racy Victorian writer. He was convicted for what was then known as acts of gross indecency, kind of for being gay, basically, in 1895. And he died in 1900 in Paris. And he was broke and he had just a few friends left. We tend to think that Wilde and the kind of spirit of the age that he created died there with him in Paris in that hotel room. And then, of course, on the other hand, we think of Hollywood. Hollywood really gets up and running in the second decade of the 20th century. The first Hollywood studios were erected in 1914. The first sound movie in 1927 was The Jazz Singer. And then the huge success of the golden age of Hollywood musicals, screwball comedies, westerns. We don't think that that world has anything to do with the world of Wilde and Europe. The new world of Hollywood was something entirely new, entirely separate. Well, it was, but it also wasn't, because cultural continuities are much more complicated than they might at first seem to be. So, when Wilde died in 1900, his works they suffered a backlash against him because he was a gay man, and a backlash against the kind of styles that he created, sort of over ornate, decadent styles. But they also symbolized rebellion and indulgence and naughtiness, really, for want of a better word. And they had a huge influence in America, not in Hollywood, not at first, but in the newspaper offices, in the theaters, in vaudeville across America in the early years of the 20th century. So Salome, which was a play that Wilde wrote in 1891 in French, was a runaway hit. It was performed in vaudeville theatres all over America. It created a phenomenon that was known as Salomania. It was so popular, and there were acting schools, dancing schools for people who wanted to perform in vaudeville as Salome. So we have this kind of this kind of underground movement, this underground number of people who were really into Wilde, and they weren't smart people. They weren't people in drawing rooms in Washington Square. They weren't people who were the really smart, really influential people of high culture. They were ordinary people who loved art and Nickelodeon shorts and vaudeville. They liked Wilde because Wilde felt like he spoke for all people, for common people, for normal people, not just the literati.
Mhm.
And so Wilde came to Hollywood from those people because it was those people, the newspaper journalists, the theatricals, the impresarios in vaudeville, who during the Hollywood boom went out west and they took Wilde with him. So in a way, we're looking for the wrong thing. When we tend to kind of think of culture, I think, an influence in very straight lines. We think of the Victorian period and the modernist period. We think of high culture and low culture. And Wilde just cut across all of that. And that's why he was so influential in Hollywood. And that's why people loved him. And I think why we still love him now.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm actually wearing flowers for Wilde and his aesthetic style. You
Excellent.
begin your book with the 1882 American tour, which I just am so infatuated with myself, where he meets Walt Whitman and Camden. He goes to all these beaches in New Jersey, New York. He's like just going all over the place, Wild, like as all these towns that he's hitting and starting in New York City. So I'm just curious, what is it about his American tour, Kate, that was just a necessary starting point? Is it even the types of lectures that he's giving?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I think, and this is just my view, but my view is that Wilde found on that tour, he realized that what he was best at, now he wanted to be a poet, he wanted to be a playwright, he wanted to be taken seriously, but on that lecture tour, he found out that what he was best at was being Oscar Wilde. And he was better at that than anything else. So he says a number of things. A number of his epigrams, a number of his quips are about personality. He says, "Be yourself. Everyone else is taken. Most people are other people. Their thoughts are quotation." And he realized that he couldn't be other people. He could only be Wilde. When he was on tour, he had to fall back on himself. He went out to give a 1 year lecture tour. Now, that sounds kind of crazy because he was nobody in a way. He kind of had big ideas. He said, when he was at university, reportedly, he said, "I will be famous, and if not famous, infamous."
Mm.
And he wanted to be a somebody. But he went out there to give a lecture tour on the English Renaissance, really basically design and furniture and dress. But he realized quite quickly that he couldn't give the kind of academic lecture that he was used to seeing at Oxford. He had to improvise. He had to kind of speak in a way that people would enjoy, not just a way that people would learn something from. And you see in that tour, during that tour, his lectures evolve. They've got less content, they're less intellectual, and they're more Wilde being Wilde. He was interviewed lots and lots of times, hundreds of times during that tour because people, newspaper journalists, as he toured around the country, they all wanted to meet him because he was fun and he was enthusiastic. I think that's something we always forget about Wilde. He was an enthusiast. He wasn't a snob. Whether he went to a mine or he went to a beach or he went to a theatre or he went to a gallery or he went to meet Walt Whitman, he greeted everything with enthusiasm, with a desire to know and experience something new. He liked California best, actually. He liked California
Mm,
best because it was different.
mm,
He'd never seen anything like California. So I think that that tour was very important, first of all, because it taught Wilde about how to be a better communicator, how to talk and write in a way that people wanted to listen to him. And he didn't know how to do that before. He's learning that on the job.
yeah.
Um, and it gave him lots of material. He used a lot of American characters later on in his career, um, in particularly A Woman of No Importance. And he mentions America all the time. Later on in his career, after he gets out of prison in 1897, he wants to come back to America. He talks about the money he could make in America. He wants the Ballad of Reading Gaol to be published in America first. Um, that's one side. The other side is that because he traveled around and because he was giving all of these lectures and all of these interviews, he was becoming known in America. Lots and lots of people who he met, and he met a lot of people on that tour. During those people who he met, they didn't forget him. They included people like someone called Bessie Marbury, Elizabeth Marbury, who became his theatrical agent and represented him into the 1920s. She never met him again after the early 1880s, but she continued to represent him. He met Tallulah Bankhead, the famous
Wow.
raconteur. Um, he met Fred Holland Day, who became a photographer and a publisher. He met Edgar Saltus, the writer. So he met Walt Whitman, as you said, and that was very influential on Wilde. And he met Henry James, and they didn't get on at all. So that's a whole other story. But actually, I think the most important meetings that Wilde had in terms of his longevity and his posthumous career were with people who were young people then, children, and the
Mm,
people who read the newspaper accounts about Wilde on tour and thought, wow, who's that man? He's amazing. I've never seen anyone like him. And so he left a real impression on America. And so, and after that, now I was talking a little bit before we started about research and how hard it was, difficult it was for me researching my book during COVID because I live in the UK and I basically spent the whole of lockdown um, on the websites that have American newspapers, historical newspapers, reading American newspapers from the late 19th century. And what I realized was that Wilde came up in the newspapers in America a lot after his tour as well. So when Wilde was arrested and imprisoned, the New York Sun and the Washington Post followed that. It was front page news. Wilde was still front page news. And when he died, that was front page news. So Wilde didn't really leave American consciousness after the tour. He stayed as this almost mythical figure, this kind of exciting figure.
mm. So I know that in your book, in your preface even, are very adamant to explain up front that Wilde, sadly passes away before like silent film or like any of
Yeah,
this industry of American cinema, but he was maybe the through line is he loved being photographed.
yeah,
And I wonder like whether you think his love of photography has anything to do with eventually how some of his plays, or in the case of Dorian Gray,
yeah.
a novel is made into early film adaptations with silent film. Like, is there any connection there because of like you said, he was embracing celebrity culture and being a public intellectual. So his material is already ripe for the film treatment.
You're absolutely right there. Yes, it was. Wilde had a very visual imagination. In that way, he was very much ahead of his time. So um, the picture of Dorian Gray, as many of you may know, was published in 1891. Well, it was published first of all in periodical form in America, first of all, not in Britain, but published first in America. And then that was in 1890. And then in 1891, he published an expanded form, an expanded version of the novel in Britain and America. That novel is very, very visual. It's not just that the picture moves, though the picture changes, of course. The whole premise is that Dorian Gray's picture grows old instead of Dorian's. So we're looking at literally a moving picture, and then what should be an inanimate picture, disembodied, moving in time. But
Mm.
Wilde was probably very much influenced by early cinema technology, like the praxinoscope. So the praxinoscope is a kind of a very early movie, not quite a movie camera, but a camera, which is like which uses mirrors and lights and reflection to project a picture on the wall. So it was the praxinoscope is the first projected moving picture that existed. And that came out in the 1880s. We don't know that Wilde saw it, but it seems to me likely that he the way in which he writes about the picture of Dorian Gray, and there's a lot of ghostly, spooky lighting. There's a lot of ideas of the picture of Dorian Gray is he calls it the most magical of mirrors.
Mm.
And we see this kind of projection throughout the novel. In his last years, when he was in exile around Europe, he loved having his photograph taken then as well. He got he got a he got he got a camera, and he had his photograph taken in Rome. And when he wrote to his friend Robbie Ross, um, I think he might have sent him one of the photographs from Rome, but he said that he wishes that he wishes that he had become a photographer, that he would have been a photographer if the technology had existed earlier. And I just love that. And I didn't see that. It's in his letters, it's in Wilde's collected letters that, and I hadn't seen that till quite recently since I finished writing the book. But it did make me think about his visual imagination and the way in which he loved to capture people. I think he'd have been a portrait photographer because he liked posing for the camera. And as you said, or as you alluded to, he had his photograph taken most famously, probably, in New York City when he arrived for that tour. And his photograph was taken by Napoleon Cerrone, who was then really the very first celebrity photographer. And Wilde really knew what he was doing by having Cerrone photograph him. It was a it was a really great publicity move for him, because then those photographs were sent around the US to help publicize his tour, and they made him into not just a writer. In a way, anyone could be a writer. Then there were loads of writers, but it made him into an icon, a star.
Well, and something that I feel you're bringing up that's so innovative with this publicity and press is, if I remember correctly too, um, he was also supposed to dispel or explain Gilbert and Sullivan's new operetta Patience, because like he was even being hired as a publicist for Gilbert and Sullivan. But then, like you said, he pulls the carpet out from under Gilbert and Sullivan and then makes it all about him
Mm.
whetting the appetite of the American public so that they're ready for his plays to hit New York stages. So it's like this really interesting way of playing with the American public
Mm.
that he's going to do like early publicity because usually a playwright doesn't do publicity until after the work is already starting to premiere, like to gain more acknowledgement. So how, I mean, just how brilliant you have to, you're bringing to bear, Kate, is just how innovative he was with understanding public relations and a concept of culture of iconoclasm before that really even existed. So, like there weren't really press agents the way there are now.
No, no, exactly. He had to be his own press agent, and other people tried to. I mean, you mentioned the way in which he was sort of operating for Gilbert and Sullivan. You're right. So Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta, Patience, seemed to parody Wilde one of the figures who feature in that operetta. And so the person who publicized that operetta also became Wilde's publicist to get Wilde to tour around to do some sort of free publicity for Patience. But like you say, Wilde turned the tables. I think he knew what was going on, but he didn't have any better ideas. It's not like he had a job to go to. He was kind of working out what he was going to do next. And so he thought, well, why not go to America for 11 months? Fine. That's cool. I'd be paid. And I've never been to America. So he had a very sort of devil may care attitude for things like that. But yeah, when he was there, he saw that I think he had an instinct for it. So I don't even, I mean, Wilde was incredibly intelligent, but I don't even think it was intelligence. I think it was an instinct. He
Mm.
just knew what to do to create a storm. And he really wanted to do it because he fed off publicity. And I think that really defines his career. So two things define his career that aren't very intellectual. So lots of intellectual things define his career. And as I said, he was an incredibly creative, intelligent, interesting, and brave man as well. But he was also, there were those two things. One was attention. He loved to have attention. The other thing was money. He always wanted more of it. He earned quite a lot, but he spent more. So
Mm.
no matter what he earned, he needed to spend more. So America really appealed to him, not just during the tour, but afterwards for his plays and for selling the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which I mentioned a little while ago, because he knew he could make better money. And that's why I think that if he hadn't died in 1900, he'd have gone to America. If he would been well enough, if he could have got the money together, he'd have ended up in the US and probably in Hollywood if he'd lived longer, because he would write, and he probably wouldn't have lived long enough for the talkies, but if he had, he'd have written great dialogue because he wrote dialogue better than anything else. So when his so um when his plays became huge successes on the American stage, in university productions, college productions, amateur dramatic productions, they were then pretty popular for radio adaptation. I've mentioned in my book that the first NBC coast to coast broadcast was a broadcast of a Wilde play, For the Importance of Being Earnest, because it's very good to listen to. It's all his plays are all about dialogue. They're not about action. They're all about quite a small cast being witty, those social comedy plays. And so they really lent themselves to radio, and then the style lent itself to talking pictures, I think.
Well, and there's this word you use called wildish, which I really love when you introduce this into your work about the spirit of being wildish, and it comes from the film director Ernst
And Flip,
Lubitsch.
yeah,
And he just uses this as like an aesthetic style for early 20th century cinema. So I'm just curious, like, what is that concept? Like, is this something?
Wildish spirit. Yeah,
Yes, yes. Does that come from one of Wilde's um film adaptations, or is this just an aesthetic style that the film director, is coining to just explain something decadent in early film?
yeah. Um, it's a coinage of Lubitsch's. So the film director Ernst Lubitsch, the German director, who, like a lot of um, the founders of Hollywood, had come to Hollywood to really make his fortune, I guess, in the early 1920s. He was already a very respected director in Germany, and he made these quite, in a sense, kind of quite bawdy sex comedies in Germany. But he wanted to be better. And I think we always have to remember that Hollywood in the late 1910s and early 1920s is always experimental. It's a Hollywood that is coming into being. It's an industry that doesn't know where it's going, that's making things up on the wing, and that's really exciting, I think. Lubitsch is a great innovator. He came to Hollywood thinking that he was going to make a more sophisticated kind of comedy to that which was being made in Hollywood at the time. And when he was put under contract with Warner Brothers, he decided, because he had a lot of power within his contract, he decided that he would do an adaptation of Oscar Wilde's play, Lady Windermere's Fan.
Mm.
Lady Windermere's Fan is one of Wilde's social comedies. It's a funny play in some ways about the British upper classes, and its comedy really centers on its funny dialogue. Now,
Mm.
this is 1924 that he starts to think about this. There's a big problem, of course. The big problem is that there are only silent pictures. How can you make a really funny silent movie based on a play that is only funny in words? There's no physical comedy in Wilde's plays whatsoever. It's sort of mad. And before Lubitsch, there had been a number of adaptations of Wilde's social comedies, and they're quite bad. They're quite bad. I don't suggest that you watch them, because they're quite melodramatic. They take out the comedy, or they put the comedy onto the title cards, and it's just not funny when you read it in the same way. It doesn't have the sort of pace and excitement of when you hear it on the stage, that sort of frisson that you get in the theatre. So the question was, in 1924, when Lubitsch got hold of Lady Windermere's Fan, could Wilde be funny on film? And it seemed unlikely that he could be. But Lubitsch had this idea of wildish spirit. So we are getting back to wildish spirit. Sorry, we've gone all around the houses, but I'm coming back to wildish spirit. So Lubitsch thought that what he wanted to do was to capture that thing that was funny about Wilde's words and to translate it into a new language of pictures, of moving pictures. The question was how to do that. And what I've tried to do in my writing about Lubitsch is to try to articulate how he makes wildish spirit, the wildish spirit of Wilde's words, into moving pictures. I think that the way he does that is to capture their irony, their insouciance about values, about morality, about sin, say, and to put that into subtle gestures on the screen. So up to this point, a lot of silent cinema was about really quite, as you will know, was about really quite um, um, physical comedy, quite obvious physical jokes and bawdy humor, you know, kicking someone on the up the bum, squaring up against someone, a fight, um, something really wonderful, but also kind of obvious. And Lubitsch wanted his physical comedy to be much more subtle, to be subversive in that way, to be sophisticated. So for him, that's what Wildish spirit is. Wildish spirit is like a nod and a wink, saying, you don't take this seriously, do you? You don't take these values seriously, do you? You don't take society seriously. And Lubitsch wrote about Wilde and about Wildish spirit in the New York Times. And that was when he had this idea, when he wrote about this idea of Wildish spirit. And of course, it wasn't long, it was only 2 years later that Talking Pictures began, and Wilde could have been made into Wilde's comedies could have been made into talking picture adaptations, but they weren't at that point. They did, though, influence Lubitsch's own comedy hugely. That wildish spirit actually becomes what's known by film scholars as the Lubitsch touch, I think.
Hmm. Well, so I'm just curious, Kate, for you. There's a difference and maybe it's not a strong difference or a drastic difference, but there is a difference between in your work when you're looking directly at Wilde film adaptations from his works and then this type of wildish spirit or how his
Mm.
style is found in films like Laura or
Yeah.
even if it can be found in even current films, like you do make a difference that there is the direct film adaptations and then there's those that are aesthetically inspired by Wilde. Could you like explain just that difference or parsing out how much you see a similarity and even if your research on both of those pathways differed a lot?
Yeah, no, it was kind of a mess. So I was a mess. It was a mess. Everything was a mess. So I had this sort of I had this sort of like nervous breakdown over it because I, no one's written about Wilde and cinema before. And the thing is, if you're kind of doing something completely new, and it all felt a bit random, really. You know, I had this hunch that Wilde had influenced various things, but I had to prove it, and that took a lot of work. I knew that Wilde, and so as building a picture through different bits, and I didn't know for quite a long time that there was a book to be written. So I started off researching Wilde adaptations. As I said already, there are a number of Wilde adaptations. There's the Lubitsch one. There are various adaptations of his play Salome. There are a couple of adaptations of The Picture of Dorian Gray. And I sort of wrote about them. And I liked writing about them, but also it wasn't quite what I wanted to do. I thought, all right, adaptation. Yeah, adaptation's fine. And we can learn about adaptation. Um, and it's interesting, but I kind of thought there's something else that's more difficult to get at in Wilde's influence. Those adaptations of Wilde's work, they're not they're not shaping a culture. They're nice adaptations, but they're some they're I what I wanted to get at was this my sense that there was something bigger going on in American culture. Wilde was a part of that. He's not the only part of it, but this engagement with Wilde from that tour in 1882 through to the late 1940s is influenced by and influences a real development in modern American consciousness, I think, particularly regarding sexuality and mass entertainment. So, what I wanted to do was work out how Wilde passes into public consciousness away from the adaptations. And I think you're absolutely right to mention that Lubitsch film as a real turning point, because at that point, with Lubitsch's adaptation of Lady Windermere's Fan, Wilde sort of takes flight, and Wildish Spirit is not an adaptation of Wilde. It's not even Oscar Wilde. It is a kind of spirit of the age. It's, as I said before, it's an irony, it's a satirical glance at what most people think are unassailable values. It's a nod and a wink to the gay person or the queer person in the back row who feels like they're on their own. And it's a kind of ironic reworking or revision of what society thought were its values. And that's how Wilde starts to influence screwball comedy after Lubitsch, how Wilde influences gangster films, how Wilde influences films like Laura and the dandy in Laura, wonderful dandy, of course, who's played with epigrammatic wit. Of course, he's the killer in the end. And all of that stuff that I've just said could just be in my head, except it's not, because I went back and I traced the screenwriters and actors who starred in and wrote those films, and was able to trace that quite a number of them were directly related, in that had direct links to Wilde in their earlier work. So what I've tried to do is to take the kind of big idea that I had about Wilde influencing the culture, and then researched how that ties directly back to Wilde, because you've really got to put in the sort of scaffolding of that idea for it not to be just kind of some mad fancy that Wilde relates to horror films. But he does relate to horror films, of course, because those of you who know those Universal Studios 1930s B movies, those wonderful horror films, like like starring Peter Lorre, or any number of other European men, Ernest Thesiger. Those people had earlier performed in Wilde comedies. Sometimes the screenwriters used Wilde's epigrams to like pepper the screenplay with a sense of homoeroticism. So in one of the most mad films I've seen, it's called Mad Love. I think you can see it on YouTube, and it's definitely worth a look. Mad Love was made in 1935, and I think it's another one of these Universal Studios horror films. 1935, stars Peter Lorre, great actor who, of course, was in Casablanca, and he's I don't think I'm giving anything away here. he's a killer. He's a baddie because he's European. And that's how your Universal B movies work. So he starts killing people, and he becomes obsessed with this woman. And as he runs toward her to kill her, he says, he screams, "Each man kills the thing he loves," which is a quote from The Ballad of Reading Gaol, a quote from Wilde. It's a very unusually explicit version of something we see quite a lot, and that's Wilde in horror movies, or used by bad guys, villains,
Mm.
to actually to create a sense of their of them being bad, of them being mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Now, this is the flip side of what we were talking about before, I think. I was saying before about how Wilde is a sort of empowering presence in a way, a kind of symbol of queer humor and insouciance in the face of
Mm.
um, morality or moral laws. But actually, at the same time, alongside that, on the flip side, in horror films, in films noir, um, that Wildean wit is then often turned into something menacing, something threatening, something dangerous to society. One example of that is, and this is one of my favorite discoveries, but actually during my research, but actually also one of the saddest, was an actor called Laird Krieger, who's not very well known today, but he in 1940 he was an aspiring actor living in his car in Los Angeles, and he heard about a new play called Oscar Wilde, which was in New York at the time. It had come to New York from the London stage, and it was the first biographical play on Oscar Wilde, and it starred Robert Morley, a British actor. Laird Krieger thought that he would like to bring that play, Oscar Wilde, to Los Angeles, and he wanted to play Oscar Wilde himself, and he did. It was an incredible feat. So it opened on Hollywood Boulevard, and lots of movie people went to see it in 1940. And Laird Krieger became the toast of Los Angeles very briefly in 1940. He was put under on contract by 20th Century Fox, but
Mm.
then and he was huge success as Oscar Wilde. He had a stature like Wilde. He was tall, he was heavily built, he was universally admired for his performance as Oscar Wilde. But then when he was put under contract um, with with Fox, he was cast only as villains. So
Ah.
he was cast not only as villains, but there were at least three off the top of my head, I think three or four films in which he starred as a killer with a double life. So Oscar Wilde led a double life as a
Mm.
family man and as a gay man, and Laird Krieger was then cast, having played Oscar Wilde, as a man with a double life, but with a very dark, nefarious double life. And I don't think that was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a coincidence. It was Hollywood, or certain people in Hollywood, thinking, okay, man with a double life. Okay, let's kind of tease out the sinister aspects of that. There's something really sinister to them about Wilde as well. Laird Krieger died really tragically young in his 40s. He died after just a few years in Hollywood of a heart attack. But he was going to star in The Picture of Dorian Gray, a new adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray in 1945. And I found that information. I was in the Margaret Herrick Library in Beverly Hills, and they have these memos in the Margaret Herrick Library. It's one. Have you been there, Andrew? Have you ever been
No,
there?
no, but this sounds fascinating. I would
Well,
love to go.
all research libraries need to be like the Margaret Herrick Library. So it's all marked because it's been founded by movie people.
Mm.
And you sort of you get off the bus, because I'm British, I take the bus everywhere. So I got off the bus, and you're kind of surrounded by plastic surgery and Botox centers, and then there's the Margaret Herrick Library, and so I was in there reading memos, Hollywood memos about who could star in Dorian Gray, and reading an unpublished script actually, which maybe we'll come back to later on, which
Mm.
features in my book.
Well, something that I find you have the chapter where you read the aesthete as monster, and then that's where I was so drawn to your queer interpretation of Dorian Gray. I'm just curious, it's kind of like you've really shed light, Kate, on this how Wilde himself is both seen in his um personality as the satirist, the comedian, the more playwright. And then you have his novelist nature, which is more the decadent gone queer or the villainous queer, which is really all brought to bear in Dorian Gray. And I'm kind of wondering when his films were being adapted for Hollywood, I mean,
Mhm.
Salome and Dorian Gray have so much eroticism. And then you
Yeah.
have like the homoerotic themes. How were they able to get past censorship? Because especially with Salome, like
Yeah.
from reading that play, you know, the whole biblical story is she's seducing the king. And like
No.
it's all about the voluptuousness of her body. So that seems like it's also a question you had to deal with Hollywood censorship and how
Mhm.
that went through a whole change after it being in having, I think, really a lot of freedom
Yeah.
with like going into erotic themes and then how they started to go through the whole Hollywood rating system.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there is a parallel here between Wilde's time and Hollywood during the production code, um, because Wilde himself was used to negotiating with censorship during the 1890s when he was writing. You had to pass a play that the play a play had to be passed by the Lord Chamberlain's office as being fit for public performance. And Salome was banned in 1892 from public performance. So it was never performed publicly in Wilde's lifetime, or not that he saw it anyway. Um,
Mm.
and he was often kind of trying to negotiate the censors. So in response to critics of the picture of Dorian Gray, he said that he never wrote anything obscene in the picture of Dorian Gray. It's all in your imagination. And that's true. So we imagine what terrible things Dorian does. We can infer, we can imagine, but Wilde doesn't write anything explicit. It's the art of the unseen, the art of making you imagine the worst things you can imagine
Mm.
in Dorian Gray, because we know that Dorian goes off to do bad things, but we never know exactly what those bad things are. Hollywood films during the age of the production code are often like that. The production code um, was first drafted in 1930, but it didn't come into full effect. Um, it wasn't really imposed until 1934, and then it's sort of in place till the mid to late 1950s. And the art of the of imagined eroticism, it plays a large part in screwball comedy, in horror, in romance. And of course, we have all these codes in Hollywood cinema for sex instead of actually showing it because it couldn't be shown. So in a way, Hollywood cinema is perfect for Wilde because Wilde loved the implication of naughtiness, naughty things that you can imagine that you can't really do. Um, Salome was only filmed once during the kind of height of Hollywood. There was a Rita Hayworth film that's not very good. Um, and the film predates the motion picture production code. It was created in it was filmed in 1922 by someone called Alan Azimova, and then Salome sort of took sort of a took on a life of her own, really, in the American imagination. So you see Salome come up a number of times. There is a frankly terrible, 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 terrible um, Salome song in a Gene Kelly film, the name of which will come back to me in a moment. But in fact, maybe I won't tell you because it's so bad. In fact, I mentioned it in a university talk I gave a few years ago, and someone in the audience emailed me to tell me that she couldn't get the song out of her head, and it was all my fault because she looked it up on YouTube. So bad. Um, in this Gene Kelly film in the early 1940s, Salome is reimagined as a sort of diva who is the origins of jazz music. It's sort of mad. Um, Elsewhere, by the late 1930s, Wilde isn't really filmed, so he's not being adapted. But there is this sort of nod and a wink mentality that I've mentioned that Hollywood gets from Wilde. So I give you an example that's related to Salome, in fact, and that's Sunset Boulevard. So Sunset Boulevard, written by Charles Brackett and Billy Wilder, and produced in 1949, starring Gloria Swanson, of course, as the silent movie actress Norma Desmond, who has left her glory days behind and who lives in her mansion on Sunset Boulevard. In that screenplay, Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett draw on Salome when Norma talks about what she'll use for her big comeback that she plans, and of course will never happen. She says she'll play Salome. And it's because she doesn't care that she's an older woman and that Salome is supposed to be a 16-year-old girl. Of course she can do it. Now that's drawing on Nazimova's Salome. Nazimova played Salome, produced it when she was too old to play Salome, when she was 44. But Charles Brackett and Billy Wilder also drew on the importance of being earnest. Joe, the young writer, the young reporter who ends up in this sort of mutually destructive relationship with Norma, is given away in his romance with someone else by a cigarette case, just as in the importance of being earnest. And so it's a sort of dramatic device in Sunset Boulevard, as it was in Oscar Wilde's 1895 play, The Importance of Being Earnest. But that cigarette case and the cigarettes and the idea of leading a double life, which is played for laughs in The Importance of Being Earnest, is brought in as a motif to suggest the unshowable, the unsayable in Sunset Boulevard, and that's that Joe is having a sexual relationship with somebody else, but also that what Joe is supposed to be doing with Norma is probably also sexual, as well as writing for her, that there's something else that could not be said or really implied in 1949.
So do you find that the Dorian Gray, like say the 2000s version, or any more recent Wilde
Yeah.
um film adaptations? I mean, Dorian Gray is the one that comes to my mind because it was more of a Hollywood blockbuster,
Yeah.
that because they were able to do more, like there's Dorian gets involved in like an orgiastical scene.
Yeah.
There's not a lot left to the imagination. Do
Yeah.
you think it's more or less successful in its queerness than, say, the Angela Lansbury version, where there's just the implied cruising, or,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Dorian with Lord Henry, or Basil, they're just all gazing at each other's eyes, and it follows more of the novels. Like you said, you're supposed to fill in the gaps, like Jekyll and Hyde. Like you're
Yeah.
in Jekyll and Hyde, we don't really know what Hyde is doing on his off time. We just know that it's something queer and unscrupulous. So what's more
Hmm.
effective in your opinion? I mean, I guess you could also say that of Dracula too,
For
follows a
sure.
similar
Yeah.
Hollywood trajectory.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I agree with the comparisons. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that Wilde's Dorian Gray learns a lot from Jekyll and Hyde. He read Jekyll and Hyde. Jekyll and Hyde came out just a few years earlier, and he's influenced by Jekyll and Hyde, by Robert Louis Stevenson. Um, Personally, I find The Unsaid is more effective. I think it's like when Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart um, have a cigarette,
Yes.
and and you know what's implied, but the frisson of not showing it, the frisson of imagining, is, I think, more erotic in a way. I think that it's something we've definitely lost. It's something we don't have so much today because everything is shown and we're such a visual culture. And I think that in a way, our we see so much and we're so exposed to explicit images and just I mean, when I say explicit, I'm thinking like a Victorian here. I mean, just like seeing quite uncovered bodies in advertising, and then of course the sort of ready availability of porn like around, means that maybe I think we're a bit desensitized as well to the erotics of um, the visual image. Whereas for someone like Wilde, when so much went unshown and unsaid, the idea of even imagining these images was so exciting, was so sensual,
Mm.
so transgressive. Even to have those thoughts, the places that Wilde takes you or asks you to go in Dorian Gray are just unspeakable and terribly transgressive for someone who is his contemporary reader. I would say, having said that, and I'm making it sound like I don't like the more recent adaptation, but my favorite adaptation, and no one agrees with me about this, nobody, but they should, because my favorite adaptation is a British Italian adaptation of Dorian Gray, which is a soft porn adaptation from 1970. And
Mm.
it's just so camp. It's kind of glorious. And Dorian literally drops soap in a shower and then winks at Lord Henry. It's like it's beyond. I want to write about it because I just think it's like it's so terrible, but it's a work of genius.
Mm.
Um, and so I think that the campness of Wilde is is also part of the pleasure and the fun. I really think that we can sometimes be too serious about Wilde. I think that in a way, I mean, Andrew, you and I are both academics, and I don't I don't want to be, I don't mean to be disloyal to our profession, but I think that we do sometimes in universities suffer from an excess of seriousness. And a
Mm.
lot of criticism of Wilde has really tried to draw out, or has drawn out in very interesting ways, his politics, his serious interests and interventions in social justice. Um, and actually, at the same time, he is fun. And the reason why he's so effective, um, in making us rethink, or making people through history rethink morality and values, is because he seduces us with his enthusiasm, with his fun. And then we start to take things that we thought were serious less seriously, and things that we thought were frivolous with a bit more care, I think.
Hmm. I agree. I think that um, there's such a focus, especially in the Victorian age. I would say that there's this gap that I'm so glad you're bridging with, your work on Wilde and how he's influenced an industry that he wasn't even alive for. But I think that in academia, there can be such this intensity with Victorian studies
Yeah.
that you have to like know everything about the genre or about um the novelists, that you need to know exactly what they studied at Oxford. Or like, I think it's fascinating that Wilde was going to be a Greek scholar, but like some people
Mhm.
have dedicated all their time that he was just a dispossessed Greek scholar, like couldn't hack it as a Greek scholar. So then he went into this whole other um abandoned his studies, but instead of seeing like you have that he was an entrepreneur in a way, and that it's okay to just laugh at the work and enjoy how it's inspired this other art form. So, a question that I did have, like, as we're, heading towards the end, Kate, is you have this ending that you call Hollywood Rebel. And all I could think of was James Dean and Rebel Without a Cause.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. But like there's so much even Hitchcock films. I'm thinking of Strangers on a Train, which is
yeah.
by Patricia Highsmith first,
Mhm.
and adapted. But there's so much it seems that Wilde, whether you're saying implicitly or explicitly, and I don't think it matters necessarily, that this aesthetic he has really just carries over into Hollywood's own aesthetic, which is sometimes mocking itself, sometimes, like you said, it didn't even know where it was going to end up. I think right now we're even at a crossroads in Hollywood because of streaming services, and they don't really know what they're going to bring to the mainstream and what they're just going to release on, say, Netflix or Max. And I think that's an interesting innovation right now. So, with all of that said, like, what do you think even with the current, I would say like the current industry, do you still see with films that are being produced that your analysis um has a bearing on what's currently premiering in 2024?
Well, I think that yeah, so it's a good question. I think that to start with Hitchcock and others,
Mhm.
yeah, I think that Wilde's influence carries on. It carries on past where I stopped writing. Um, so I kind of finished around the late 1940s, 1950. Um, but actually, someone like Hitchcock in his later films is haunted by Wilde. Hitchcock was really into Wilde. He read The Picture of Dorian Gray many times. He was very into the decadent movement that Wilde was part of. And I've written a little bit about that elsewhere. Um, Someone like Noel Coward as well, very influenced by Wilde. And then if we've got various other sort of bits and pieces of people. And I sort of cut them out mostly because they were confusing matters. But what they do, someone like Hitchcock, is he takes a sort of Wildian aesthetic and often Wildian themes. So if you think about something like Vertigo, um, a film like Vertigo, which I think is 1957, isn't it? 1957. Um, so Vertigo takes a number of Wildian themes from Wilde's short fiction. In fact, The Secret of the Sphinx um, is very influential on that film and reworks them into something new. And by the 1950s, we are looking at something new. Wilde has sort of run into, or sort of the Wildean influences have diffused through Hollywood, I think, they've mixed with lots of other influences, and it then become very difficult to recognize or to call Wildian or even Wildish anymore, because they're not. They've evolved into a new form that is distinctly Hollywood. At the same time, I think that Wilde doesn't ever go away. And the way in which Wilde sort of helped to shape Hollywood with that sort of frivolous spirit, that ironic spirit, that satirical eye of his that we've talked about, and that witty repartee that came to influence the repartee of screwball banter. That those ways in which Wilde influences Hollywood means that Hollywood can come back to Wilde, because Hollywood, even Hollywood as it is now, already feels like it knows Wilde. He never went away. He was always there. So if you see something like the success of the 1997 biopic starring Stephen Fry called Wilde, simply,
Mhm.
or the Al Pacino adaptation Salome, or even the fact that Sarah Snook from Succession is currently starring in a stage production of The Picture of Dorian Gray in London, which I believe will go to New York
Oh, wow.
next. And it's been optioned as a film now. And it's very influenced by cinema. All of these things and many more suggest that Wilde, or suggest to me, the beginnings of some evidence that Hollywood still has a relationship, a sense of familiarity with Wilde. Going back to the conversation we had a little while ago about university academics and Wilde, I'd just say that that relationship between Hollywood and Wilde is not because I or any of my colleagues have written a book on Oscar Wilde. I mean, our books are fine, and there are some really wonderful books on Wilde, such as by my colleague Michelle Mendelssohn, for people who are interested
Yes.
in Wilde's American tour. Michelle's book is excellent, Making Oscar Wilde. Or on the trials, Joseph Bristow has written a book, Trials of Oscar Wilde, very recently came out. Many others. We've all written very scholarly books, but actually the reason why Wilde is in public consciousness, the reason why people still go to sell out productions of his plays isn't because of us. It's because, obviously, it's because Wilde was popular, because Wilde spoke to people who weren't academics,
Mhm.
and that his humor, but also his wisdom, meant something to them then, and still does now, I think. And it's that sort of that beautiful way that Wilde had about him, which was not academic. It wasn't too intellectual at all, but it was fun.
Yeah. And this is where I feel that whether you're reading Wilde or Whitman or even Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market, one of my favorite Victorian poem, probably my favorite Victorian poem. I'll
Really, really.
I'll say it. Yes. Like, and I do.
Own
I
it, own
love,
it. Go on.
yes. I love though, Robert Browning's verse. But I think there's a difference, like you're saying, Kate, between say Hopkins or Browning, like the more linguistic poets who really have the classic education, like they want the classic education to be part of their poetry. And that even though Wilde had the education, he didn't put it into his work. He wasn't trying
No,
to
no.
um he wasn't trying to limit his audience. And I think the way that he makes his work so public,
Yeah,
it's so it's so interesting what you're doing with your work, because I feel that you're really putting front and center that even the Hollywood industry relies on literature. Like without
yeah,
literary texts, they wouldn't have had silent films, or they wouldn't have so much that they were inspired by. Like film
yeah.
studies needs literature. Like they go hand in hand.
Absolutely. And in the early days of Hollywood, they needed literature for two reasons. One was that the movie industry was trying to legitimize itself
Mm,
by drawing on novels and stage productions that would make it seem um, less like Nickelodeon, less like vaudeville, and more like kind of respectable
mm,
artwork. And if there's a huge discussion in the late 1910s or mid 1910s about whether cinema is an art form or a business, and it was deemed to be a business and therefore could be regulated like a business, not like an art form, which led eventually to censorship, or to self-regulation, movie self-regulation. But the other reason why they needed literature was because they were making movies so quickly. They needed to rely on stories that could be quickly adapted and which people already knew. So they didn't need um, words. So for silent films, they adapted what were already popular stage productions, what are already popular novels, so that they could be confident that people went into the movie theaters knowing the way it was supposed to be. So they didn't need too many title cards and they could follow the story. And they were there really for the thrill of seeing the story that they already knew brought to life in moving pictures. And that, I mean, Wilde was adapted because he was already popular,
mm.
and because people would come to see him, and they could be kind of guaranteed an audience, I suppose.
Yeah. So one of my like final questions, not maybe not the final, Kate, but it is so what you're doing with influence studies, I really am so in admiration, but also you're speaking my language because I'm really interested in queer influence studies when it comes to
Mm,
how even in
mm,
my work, I look a lot at Greek mythology. So something that my dissertation did, and then like I was saying to Kate, I'm going to be self-publishing it soon, which is exciting, just so more people could read it. But Greek mythology is part of what I see with Whitman's male homoerotic poetics and how he even talks about sexuality
mm.
without having sexual language, without having John Addington Symonds, without,
Yeah,
Oscar
yeah,
Wilde's now already part of sexology with his time, but Greek mythology, there's such an influence. And it's always interesting to see how Oscar Wilde turns to um Huysmans's Against Nature, that French novel, for decadent literature.
yeah,
And there's
yeah,
always like some text before.
yeah,
So like what you're saying is these filmmakers turn to Wilde, even for Sunset
yeah.
Boulevard. And it's like influence studies is so, I feel, important to understand cultural movements. And I think if you could just speak about like why is influence studies, you think, Kate, something that we're currently grappling with? Like it is a very emerging field. Does it have something to do with our current moment right now?
Oh, that's such a good question. I wish I had a good answer to that. I want to ask you what you think in a second. I'm just thinking. So Wilde was very interested in influence himself. He said because in Dorian Gray, Lord Henry talks about influence. He wants to influence Dorian, and his
Mm,
influence on Dorian is malign, is and Wilde himself thought that influence itself was immoral because it it kind of shaped someone to be what they didn't want to be. He he felt very bitter in the end about what he thought was the influence of Alfred Douglas, his young lover, on him. Um, but I think you're right. I think the influence studies is really fascinating because it's a story both of influence, but always of transformation. every influence is a transformation too. You take somebody's influence, but also, I mean, certainly in regards to culture, in the act of taking that influence, the person who is influenced or the art form that's influenced makes something new out of it. It's part of a process of evolution, of cultural evolution, which takes us forward into the future. It's not necessarily progress, but it does take us forward into the future. I wonder. I kind of think I I probably shouldn't talk about the present because I feel so depressed about it that it might
Well,
not be a good way to end. What do you think about? What do you think, Andrew, about influence studies today?
well, I think that like the younger generation, which I consider your work too, Kate, of like emerging, I should say emerging texts in literary studies.
Mm,
I think that right now, where there was that, what you're looking at is the innovative Hollywood industry and how that's relying on literary texts for influence. I think right now we're looking at social media and you now have a term called influencer that how do we understand how people are actually changing people's perspectives and opinions? This isn't anything new, but it's now like you've said about how quickly you can get information and whether that be fact checked or not, which a lot of it is not. Right now, we're seeing how influencers are relying on previous forms of celebrity culture to try to disseminate information. So I think right now we're trying to just understand what the word influence even means. Like, I think we're trying to break apart social media. And I think, like, right now, we're in need of studies around social media because it is a quickly growing field and it
mm,
doesn't have really a lot of um academics texts around it. Like I don't really think we can yet point to um people looking at say Instagram as a literary text, but it is. It's just
yeah.
we have to just understand how previous art industries thought about influence, thought about even like in my in my case, queer influence is so interesting because I think that right now we're even grappling, not just in social media, but with younger generations, Gen Z, even Alpha, who's after them, that they're even using different ways to talk about sexuality. So I think we're kind of in a way back to, in my opinion, the 1890s when you saw homosexuality emerge as a word. And I
Yeah.
think now people are saying, well, what language do we really need? Like, what's speaking to our culture? And
Yeah.
that's an influence question, in my opinion.
I think that's really very interesting, and I think that has a very important bearing on how we talk about books as well and the future of criticism and what we should be focusing on as critics. I do often feel, perhaps this is me being negative, but I often feel that as literary critics, as you said, I'm an academic in English literature in a university, but I feel that maybe this is how people felt in the 1890s if they were classicists, if they did Greek poetry, that
Yeah.
fewer and fewer people were really that into it, and you're sort of thinking, well, how do we create a new critical language to talk about the things that are really shaping culture? And so there's a great deal of it that's very exciting, but it's also very precipitous. You're sort of thinking, I don't know how we can talk about how we can construct the critical language to think about social media in really intelligent, but also groundbreaking and rigorous ways. How do we really unpick apart how that kind of influence works, how that operates within culture. What skill sets do we need? What new skill sets do we need to develop in order to have those conversations?
Yeah. But like having intellect, like a salon like this, or whether it be, I do think the podcast space is really like why
Yeah.
I'm so interested in like having conversations with my guests is because this is a new way of doing academia. And I always say, I think everyone is academics are now learning how to become public intellectuals. And that's not what they're trained to do during their PhD. But I think we should
Uh-huh.
start training PhDs how to access the public. And that maybe we don't have to have niche studies. Instead, we should have more of a broad understanding to talk to the person that we meet at the public library
Yeah. Yeah.
or going to the public library and talking. I think it's right that shapes culture and that's actually impacting change. And I think what you're saying too is how do we impact change as critics?
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
and I think Wilde is a great figure because he was on the ground impacting
Yeah.
conversations.
Yeah.
So
I
fascinating.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And it's a really interesting and big area that I think we'll see come into focus over the coming years.
Yeah. Well, and I've even had people ask me, Kate, if your book is going to be an audiobook, because
Oh,
that's something else I've tried to address with academic presses. Is I keep saying, can we please start to bring more audiobooks? Because, audiobooks are just,
yeah.
they might even be consumed now more, maybe not more than print books, but I think we're such a multitasking uh walking or running, like I'm a runner like you are too, and I'll turn on podcasts or audiobooks for inspiration, and
Yeah.
hopefully, if Oxford Press is listening, they will, start to do an audiobook
That would be
imprint.
great because I like listening as well. I listen to a lot of podcasts because we're often multitasking, right? We're often doing things on the go and we spend a lot of time reading. So it's nice to be able to consume a different way. There's much more of a culture in the UK of radio, and I listen to the radio
Yes.
of the time.
Yes, yes, I know one of my um uh passions, or if I could like expand the audiobook industry, would be to have all current academic books turned into audiobooks. But that's like, you know, if someone wants me to start getting that ball rolling, I think it would be a wonderful way of getting this out to the public, which is why I'm so glad we had this conversation, Kate, because, people might have said before they started listening to this, well, I don't really know a lot about Oscar Wilde. Like, if I don't know a lot about him, how am I going to be able to pull apart or understand the conversation? But this was just such a wonderful way of bringing to bear how Hollywood, which is full of glitz, well, we think it's full of glitz and glamour. Again, that's the facade, but how it really has so much to do with this wildish spirit or this aesthetic movement, and how the aesthetic movement of Wilde's time carries into even what we're seeing today with Hollywood. So thank you so much, Kate.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Andrew. Thank you for your comments, and it's been so nice talking to you.
Well, and for everyone, remember you can get Kate Hext's new book, Wild in the Dream Factory, Decadence and the American Movies, May 28th, um, from Oxford Press. And I know, Kate, is there anything you want to plug, like your website or how to follow you
No,
on a social
I'm
media?
very low tech. Follow me on Twitter or drop me an email if you wanna ask any questions.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thanks